Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our podcast, Truth Be Told, where we look at different aspects of our world and uncover some truths you might not have known before. As you all know, we have been talking about education in the last couple of episodes, and today we have some interesting facts and stories to bring your way. My name is Ali Heath, and I'm joined by my lovely co, Dezi Crawford. Dezi, how are you feeling today?
I'm feeling great. I'm so excited to be uncovering the news about this side of education with you today. I am also super excited to get to introduce you all to our guests. But before I introduce our amazing and wonderful guest, Allie, why don't you share with us our new fact for the day?
Absolutely. Last week, we talked about students in poverty and students of color having a lack of resources compared to their wealthy white peers. So, an article I found talked about how students who are at risk have been found to have 32 times more likely to be diagnosed with learning or behavior challenges compared to their peers. So, something to think about. If you haven't watched last week's episode, definitely go watch it. You do not want to miss it.
Thank you, Allie, for that. Now, Allie and I want to introduce you to Marjorie Barnes. Marjorie has been working in the schools for the last 5 years as a speech language pathologist. She has had anywhere from 30 to 70 students on her caseload at a time. Wow, that's a lot of kids. She is born here in Texas and immediately went to work in the schools after attending Texas Women's University for graduate school. After her fifth year working, she informed us she got extremely burnt out due to her circumstances working in what's called an underfunded or under resourced school and left the education system. We are here to find out more about what happened and what her experience looks like. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to our guest, Marjorie. How are you doing today, Marjorie?
I'm feeling amazing today. Thank you both for letting me come here and talk about my experience in underfunded schools.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you for joining us today. Will you go ahead and start by explaining to us what an underfunded or under-resourced school is?
Yeah, so underfunded and under-resourced schools are schools that are located in areas of low-income families and in general low-income areas. Due to this, the school does not have the resources it needs to provide to its students. The biggest issue we're seeing right now for Texas is not having enough teachers for these underfunded schools. Teachers are not making enough to live on their salaries and are having to go elsewhere, leaving a small pool of qualified teachers. This often leads to other teachers and employees to fill in the gaps where needed and take on extra work. SLPs in the schools are already overworked, taking their work home, covering bus duty, lunch duty, and having large caseloads. So, having extra coverage and extra responsibilities on top of all that is exhausting.
That does seem like a lot to take on with what you're already doing. When I was doing research prior to having you come and talk with us, I saw an article that talked about low income schools, specifically in rural areas, struggling to find teachers. It appeared to be so bad that these schools had to close and consolidate due to these shortages. Marjorie, are you able to speak to this? How does this affect you and the students you work with?
So it's a huge hit. Most schools have class ratios of 25 to 30 students per classroom. This means classrooms will be twice the size they usually are with smaller spaces than before. There's a good chance they will be using every room to meet the needs of all the new students, meaning SLPs like myself or other staff members might not have rooms to perform the services they need. These students are also in environments they are not where they're not able to learn and they're surrounded by so many students. It negatively impacts the teachers, staff at the school, and students all around. Thankfully, I never experienced that severe of a staff shortage where I had to relocate, but we absolutely all had to pitch in when we were short staffed. And it led me covering in areas I really shouldn't have been nor had time for.
Wow, I can imagine the difficulty in that situation. While I'm happy you never were at a place that you had to consolidate, you still shouldn't have had to do multiple jobs at once. And you know what, Desi, I also saw that article. It also talked about low income schools not having access to resources, materials, instruction, technology, and other really important resources. Marjorie, is this something you've experienced? And if so, can you share your experience navigating this?
So this is something I experienced a lot. I was not able to have the testing materials that I needed, the technology that I needed, and the therapy materials I needed due to a lack of funding or budget from the school. I often had to use tests that were available to me, even if I knew other tests worked better for the child's needs. Any therapy materials that I had to buy or find on my own, which was difficult, living paycheck to paycheck to provide for myself. And it was part of the reason I had to move on and couldn't afford to keep doing it anymore.
Oh, wow. I'm so sorry to hear that. Thank you for sharing that with us and for all the work you did. What are some other things that you've experienced working in an underfunded school?
One experience I had is that many people aren't aware of being in a rural environment, not having access to services like developmental specialists. Developmental specialists are the people that look at the psychological and mental development of our students. We had so many students that most likely qualified for services that we had to wait long periods of time while we're in the process of waiting to work with someone else in a different location. These students were not able to get all of the services they needed in a timely manner, and it overall affected their mental health, overall well being, which of course then affected their speech and language.
Ah, yes, I am very familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it sounds like that's what that looks like. If a student is not having their mental, physical, or emotional needs met, well, it makes sense they wouldn't be able to focus on their speech and language. I also think I read an article somewhere that the underfunding of these schools and in general low income situations affects their students' language development. Is this true? Can you speak more about this?
So what research has shown us is that not all low income families lead to children having language disorders. There are plenty of students that come from low income families that have normal and progressing language. However, we do see language differences in our students depending on their environment. Students with families that did not go to college, their parents who have multiple jobs, and their school does not have access to proper resources have different vocabulary compared to their peers. Low income children will still develop and have normal language. However, they might not have the academic language at the same time as other children. This might affect how they do certain assessments. And if they don't have the language, it's not because they don't know it, it's because they haven't been taught. So that's a misconception for a long time that low income children will either have disordered or delayed language. And it's just not the truth. It is important to know and consider how we can increase the type of language support that we have for our under resourced schools.
You know what? That is an amazing point, and thank you for clarifying that. I love how you talked about thinking about what to do for under-resourced schools. So, if we are seeing all these issues, what can be done? Can anything be done?
It depends on if you're wanting a real world answer or a perfect world answer. If we're just to give the schools more money and give people more money to live, it would solve so many problems. But unfortunately, this is not our reality. Realistically, I think if we pay attention to who we're voting for, advocating for, and students in our legislative issues and donating where we can, we could see a lot of change. And hopefully that slow change grows over time.
And I completely agree with all of that. I also stumbled upon an article that talked about early reading preschool programs for low income families, and this seemed to really help in those students. Have you experienced this in your practice, and maybe is this a possible solution?
Early intervention is so important for our students with speech and language. The earlier we notice language disorders and delays in our students, the faster we can support them. Without early intervention, students often go a while before they are recognized and have services, especially in under resourced schools. Additionally, not enough under resourced schools have early reading programs to support at risk students, but the districts I've seen do them are very successful. While I think it would be a great solution, it is not talked about enough in our community, nor is it as widespread as I think it should be.
Wow, that is good to know. Unfortunately, I think that is all the time we have today. Marjorie, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here.
No problem. And thank you again for having me.
Well, thank you all so much for tuning in to Truth Be Told. We hope to see you again next week for our continued series on education. And next week, we'll have another great speaker to talk about what they have experienced in the education world. So make sure you're there. Have a great rest of your week.